again.
to go.
Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry for the confusion, and thanks for walking back downstairs and then back upstairs with us. So hi, I'm Mallory. I will be the moderator for this. Welcome to Queer Folks Write About Comics. So I guess just to start off, I'm going to start us off with a question as like part of our introduction. So, say your name, and then what is comics journalism to you, and what kind of writing do you tend to do in this like sphere? So, like I said, I'm Mallory. I think for me, comics journalism is basically writing critically about comics. That kind of boils down to two subgenres, I guess. So there's the editorial subgenre, which I view as comics reviews, criticism, critical analysis, essays, things like that. And then there's the reporting side, where you're actually interviewing people, writing profiles or Q&As, and doing investigative reporting. And I tend to do more profiles and interviews. I work for NPR's All Things Considered, and investigative work, but I'd also like to kind of break into writing critically and reviews.
Hi, I'm Kat Overland. I'm the small press editor for womenwriteaboutcomics.com, and I definitely consider myself more of a writer about comics than a comics journalist, because mostly the only reporting I do are creator interviews. I'm not doing a ton of investigative deep dive profiles, and I write reviews and sometimes critical essays. It's been a while. So I feel like comics, when I think of journalism, I think of more news reporting or just anything that requires reporting versus your editorial opinions, which is more of what I write.
Cool. Hello, my name is Jon Erik. I write primarily for the MNT, which is a twice monthly subscription newsletter with comics coverage of all kinds. I'm formerly of Comics Alliance, rest in peace, and Book Riot. Historically, I write about queer topics where I can, because that's what I care most about. I used to focus a lot more on the big two, just because that was really interesting, and I used to track, queer creators and queer news and queer characters within those comics, but gradually, for a variety of reasons I'm sure we'll get into over the course of the discussion today, I moved more into writing about webcomics, primarily because there just isn't a whole lot of writing about webcomics, despite the fact that it's this enormous, really impactful field, and there's just such a volume of really incredible queer creators there. So that's what I primarily write now. I interview webcomics creators for the MNT. In terms of, what is comics journalism to me, I agree with, I echo what Mallory said. I do think in general what maybe makes comics journalism unique is a lot of things, but I think it's just there's a lot of really talented people trying their best within a context of a field that does make how journalism works in it very unique, a lot like the whole, we're moving to a different panel, just kidding, we're moving to another room. That's kind of emblematic sometimes of how journalism works in comics. So, big old asterisk, I would say.
Hi, CP Hoffman. I kind of do a bit of everything. Right now I'm writing for Nerdist and for Women Write About Comics. I've also formerly written for CBR, for Book Riot, panels.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, rest in peace. It was really sad when panels shut down. And I do some very journalistic things where I report on something and try to actually build the story, and I do some things where it's me spending 1,500 words to rant about the stupidest thing that Marvel has done in the last week. And because a lot of the stuff I do is on the paid side, not that the pay is great, which we'll get to later, a lot of my writing ends up focused on the big two, just because it's very hard to write about things like webcomics and get paid.
Hi, my name is Pidge Gunderson, and I'm affiliated with the Galaxy Garrison. Just kidding. My name is Jameson Hampton. I write for Women Write About Comics and Rogues Portal, primarily. And I do mainly reviews and some interviews. And for me, my connection, I guess, to this whole comics writing journalism thing is that, like, I really like comics, and I want other people to maybe like the same comics as me. And so for me, like, kind of the joy of it is trying to share stuff that maybe I didn't think that people might have heard a lot about, that I'm feeling joyful about. And so I write about, I don't really write about the big two at all. I write primarily about stuff that, especially queer stuff, that I think that might not have anyone write about it otherwise.
I'm CK Stewart. I use he, him pronouns, if anybody needs to refer to me by pronouns for some reason. I primarily write for the Newsarama Best Shots review team, and I am also more recently a contributor to Pace Magazine. And I think for me, I probably take both a more straightforward and also more complicated in terms of my personal work perspective about comics. I think overwhelmingly, most writing about comics is almost all editorial in some way. That's my perspective about it. From the decisions that I make about what books I want to review, from the interviews that I want to take or want to pitch, to the books that I want to cover at Pace, now that I do Kickstarter work there. For me, writing about comics is an opportunity to, I want to use that opportunity and the spaces that I've been given access to bolster voices that I don't feel are represented enough in the industry. The review team at Newsarama is fairly large. If I'm not writing about a Marvel book, it doesn't matter. There's 5 other people that are willing to write about a Marvel book that week. So if I can go to my editor and say, hey, there's an independent comic that's coming out, and by independent, I don't mean Boom, or Oni Press, or Vault. I mean, somebody's emailed me about a comic that they self-published, and it's available on Gumroad right now. Can I give this 150 words in our Thursday column? Sure. Nobody else has asked to do that, so you can cover that book if you want to. And I think those have been the opportunities that have been really valuable to me, and that's kind of shaped my perspective on that a lot. And I guess as a caveat to that, shout out to my editor at the Best Shot team in particular, who's been really flexible in terms of giving me the space to cover almost anything that I want. The only thing that's been a hard sell has been webcomics, unfortunately. It's been tougher for me to get him to let me to do that. But I'm still fighting the good fight, so we'll see where it ends up.
I'm Mey Rude. Until recently, I had a column at Autostraddle called Drawn to Comics, where with this comics journalism question, I like to say that I'm a journalism and not a journalist because what I used sometimes I would get presses would send me things and be like, hey, can you review this? Hey, can you announce this? Do you want to do an interview with this creator? But mostly I used my column to just highlight the comics that I loved and the creators that I loved and the great work that they're doing. Because everyone has said, a lot of the comics I covered were web comics or other indie comics, people printing their own things or selling it on Gumroad, whatever. And all of them said there aren't a lot of sites that do that, especially for queer comics, and especially for then when you get intersectionals, queer comics by creators of color or international creators or disabled creators, that stuff just people aren't writing about that. So yeah, I just like to talk about the comics and the people that I love.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I kind of want to talk about some of the nitty-gritty of writing about comics first, and then we can kind of talk about where this space is going. So I guess how do you all view deadline windows for pitching reviews, for receiving reviews? Are you really married to the week of or after something is published, or do you kind of have a wider window? Because for me, I just sometimes it's hard because things come out and I miss them, and then there isn't a peg anymore. A peg is something that you can hang a story on, and it's really hard for me to pitch stuff a couple weeks out, but sometimes that's when I find out about it. So how do you all kind of think about that?
One of the things that I find frustrating is there are some publishers that are fabulous about sharing review copies with comics journalists, and there are some publishers who are not. And then also I write about a lot of comics related media, and it's so hard to get like a advanced screener of like, you know, Cloak and Dagger or something, which I like basically was begging Freeform to send me so that I could write about their finale. But they didn't, so I didn't. But it's often frustrating, like being able to actually get access to the thing in a timely fashion so that writing about it, you can write about it in a way that people care.
Right, and this feels like an issue that's like pretty unique to like the comics space. Since I work with like movie publicists a lot, I'm getting emails like 5 months in advance about like trailers and posters, and I get nothing from like, I have to beg DC and Marvel, and I'm like, I work for a website that hits millions of viewers, and y'all like write for like really great comics websites. I mean, is this an issue that's only in the comics industry, and how does that affect like writing about comics?
So I was gonna say, yeah, the access to materials is a big problem for comics writing, and at Women Write About Comics, because we are an all-volunteer website, from the editorial down, it's sort of like, well, like, do you need to break your back to review this issue 1? It'd be better if you did, but I mean, like, and I'm sure my editors there that I write for are hating me right now, but as a small press editor, for me, like, I won't hear about small press stuff if the small press, if like the one person that's creating these books isn't already, if they know to mail me. So when I go to cons and stuff, it's great, and that's where I find a lot of creators, but like, even the big publishers don't particularly have marketing teams, like for reals. It's often like 2 people, and these are not insignificant publishers, so for them to do the outreach, it's just not really, they don't care, like, because they can pitch a story elsewhere. So that's how I feel about deadlines. Not that thrilled about it, but also like, I think with comics, it's sort of like, well, you can always revisit that book. It's not super urgent for me to make sure everybody can buy it like literally the week that it comes out. If it's a work that my writers want to write about, then sure, whatever.
I think 2 things I can kind of like add to that. One, I mean, talking with your point, like with, you know, Women Write About Comics being all volunteer writers, like most, if not like 95% of those of us who are writing about comics aren't, like, we're doing it not as a full-time thing. We're not, 95 is probably low. Not doing it as a full-time thing. Many not even doing full-time like freelance writing as a thing. I used to do freelance writing full-time, including comics, and that was a big portion of it, but rest in peace, Comics Alliance. And as a result, it's even harder to be able to do things like, you know, be timely and have that peg. Because even if you wanted to, even with all your heart you wanted to, if you can't make rent because you're writing for something that either doesn't pay or doesn't pay well enough, then you have to make that sacrifice. What I did do, and what I tried to do, is make having a column itself a peg. Because back at Comics Alliance, my webcomic interview column was Webcomics Q&A. Never really nailed down a title I was really happy with, but anyways.
Great title.
And gets the point across, very succinct.
So.
But by making that the peg, like, this is a column, it no longer needed to be like, and here's the newsy reason for this webcomic, because that's also tricky with webcomics.
Right.
Like, one of the biggest problems with gaining traditional coverage is very rarely do they have what maybe the publisher will consider like a peg. Short of a Kickstarter thing, which is newsworthy, but that's also, you're now valid because you're going into print, not because of anything else you could have done. And so that was something that was necessary both to, you know, the realities of my schedule, but also to, you know, make it more saleable. I mean, with that said, I always, you know, talk with my webcomics creators and be like, hey, is there an anniversary? Is there some kind of milestone that you do want to time this with? And if I can make that work, I always try to, but that's not always feasible, unfortunately.
No, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, Women Write About Comics, and one of our roundup editors is in the audience, so shout out. We've started doing Cub Watches, where we do monthly columns that just sort of cover like everything from Top Cow, and so it's like a little feature mini reviews of like the best things that reviewer thought, and like some write-ups of the rest from one publisher. So we're kind of free of trying to flip over on like monthlies or weeklies like that week, but we can still kind of be timely. So we're trying to see if that, because then we have that news column. It's a monthly column. Like, yeah.
That's the catch.
Yeah.
So I guess then, like, the comics community is small, and the queer comics community is even smaller, and then when you get into, like, the indie comics queer comics community, that gets, like, real tiny, and I feel like the Venn diagram of overlap between, like, someone who writes about comics and comics creators is, like, almost a circle. So I guess how do you all kind of view navigating relationships of, like, deciding what to cover if, like, you have a friend who's got a comic out, or I guess, like, navigating your relationships as people who write about comics, as comics critics, with, like, the queer creators that you kind of interact with online.
I was really excited about this question. Sorry, I recognize now that my face is right up in that. Usually I'm a little more thoughtful about that, but I was just so pumped up. This is actually, for me personally, this is something that I think about a lot, because I wind up, I think universally in terms of comics critics, there's kind of this running joke, I think is the kindest way to put it, that you get into comics journalism because eventually you want to write comics. I think is the perspective of a lot of people, regardless of whether or not that's true of everybody. I'm somebody, the more people ask me if I've ever thought about writing a comic, the more firmly I say I will never write a full comic in my entire life. It's a medium of fiction in which I would perform poorly. Like, you would not enjoy my comics. I will not make you read them. But I'm really great at reviews, and I'm really great at interviews, so that's what I do. For me personally, what I wind up telling people is don't ever be my friend. Like, don't ever be a person that is close to me, that we share a lot of, like, deep personal information. If we've exchanged phone numbers, we're probably friends. If you're my friend, my perspective is at that point, and part of that is the nature of my friendships. For me, it's gotten to a point where there's no way for me to feel comfortable wanting to cover your work, because if I don't like your work, I don't want to tell you. And if I do like your work, then I run the risk of having somebody come to me and say, like, I feel like maybe this work was actually objectively bad in a lot of ways, either in terms of content or in terms of execution. Why did you give this review such a great score? Like, why did you recommend this Kickstarter? Like, why did you tell me to spend money on this? And I don't know, like, what is my answer to that? Well, my friend asked me to do it, and I wasn't sure how to say no to them. So for me, I take kind of a hard line on it. There's gray areas where I've covered the works of folks, and then eventually we've become friends. And for me, that's the point at which I have to say, do I not want to do editorial work about this person's work anymore? Do I not want to interview them anymore? There are some folks whose work I'll consider reviewing because it's a big enough title that, like, I'm looking at like Marvel or DC, for example. Not a lot of cases. But there's like one or two people where maybe they have something turn up at a large publisher, and that's a situation where my editors ask me to review something, and I have to say, like, is this part of a legacy title where I can focus exclusively on this work's place in the history of a long line of comics in a similar vein, or for the same team or character? Or is this a one-shot where it's like something that my friend did that maybe I would have a kind review on? So it's a bit tricky, but I feel like of the folks I know, I feel like I've probably taken the hardest line stance. Like, I have friends now who are starting to produce comics and, like, are starting to pitch things to publishers, and they've asked me, like, what can I do if I send you something? Like, will it get reviewed? And I'm pretty firm about it. No, I personally will not review it, but because of my policy generally, anything that comes to me as a member of the Best Shots team, I'll pass on to the Best Shots team. Like, that's the best I can do. Like, I'll give everybody a fair shot to see if someone on the team is interested in reviewing this work. but like if I've stayed at your house or you've like bought me dinner more than one time for whatever reason, or we've gone to a wrestling show together, like that's the point.
How does everyone else kind of view that relationship? Do you take as hard of a line, or do you kind of like?
I do the exact opposite. Honestly. Like literally, my friend group in LA is just comics creators, and my friend group in New York is comics creators, and my friend group in Minneapolis is comics creators. You know, like, which again is why, I do like to distance myself from like actual comics journalism, because a lot of my writing specifically is, oh, my friend has a new book, I want them to be successful. I love and often or always I think with when I become friends with creators, part of it is that I'm drawn to like them as creators, and the way I think that their creativity and their art like encompass them as a person. And so if I like a person, usually I like their art, or always I think. I'm trying to think of anyone who I'm like good friends with and I don't like their art, and I can't think of anyone right now. Because they're queer creators and the queer creators of color and trans creators and all these things, you know, it's important to cover them. And I had this like weird, unique column where I didn't have to. Since it was just once a week and it was just this one column that was like basically the only comics stuff on Autostraddle, I didn't have to worry about getting all the important news. I didn't have to worry about making sure it was like fair and balanced, you know? Mm-hmm. I could just be like, oh, here's my friend. Like the two people I've stayed with here on this trip, Hazel Newlevin and Amanda Skirty. I wrote about both of them on Drawn to Comics. And so like the exact opposite. Yeah, I only write about my friends.
I've solved this problem by not having friends. So I'm golden.
Or are you just friends with like comics, people who write about comics? Or even men?
Yeah. But also I kind of think of myself in a certain way as like, if you've seen the movie Almost Famous, like the William Miller character who like travels with this band and like basically like is enmeshed in their lives for like months on end, and then writes this like, you know, totally raw story about them for Rolling Stone that you know, just like gets at all of the dirt that they've been going on for like months. And so it's like I sort of like, you know, view myself in that role where like I'll hang out with you and like we'll have a great time, but I'm not going to let it like keep me from doing my job, because at the end of the day, I am the enemy.
I was going to say, for Women Write About Comics, our editorial rule is to just disclose your friendship. Like, I know this person, if they're like your best friend, please do not cover your best friend stuff, but it's totally fine for us to cover it as an organization, and I don't, like, especially with the smaller stuff, it's so hard once you have written like 2 small press reviews and gone to like a small press show. It's like, well, shit. But I think as long as that like relationship is disclosed, and for a site that it's like, you know, we're not making money on, like it's up to the reader to kind of decide how they feel about it.
Yeah, so then I guess if we are writing about,
Just the way I see it is that like the reason I'm here in like the comics community is because I like comics, and the reason that like friends of mine that are comics creators are here in the comics community is because they love comics, and we're all like kind of participating in this thing that can sometimes be really cool, and I don't want anyone to feel like they're being punished for that. Like, I don't want people to feel like, well, because you know me now, I'm not going to get something that I might have gotten otherwise, you know, because they came and were active and were excited and were interacting with people, and I think that that is something that we should celebrate. And so I guess I take like not as hard of a line stance on it because of that. Like, I feel like we're all in this together in some ways.
Jamie, do you think you would feel differently about that if you were working for like a bigger publication, because I think for me scale is a big part of it. Like if I was a reviewer for the New York Times, it would be like, no, if like we're you know,
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
my sphere of influence would have to be different.
I would totally agree with that. I think that like I write for Women Write About Comics, like we keep mentioning, it's like a volunteer organization. Like I'm there because I want to be there, and if I didn't want to be there, I would leave, you know, and we're all laughing about it. But like I think that at a smaller publication like that, it's not disingenuous to say that like we're here because we care about this, and because of that we have a connection about it, you know?
So then does that make it hard to write like honest and sometimes sharp critique of the works of these like creators that you really do want to succeed, or they're your friend? Like is there a space for that like kind of healthy constructive criticism of work that work that your friends might produce?
I think part of it for me, I think that is the reason why I probably take such a hard line. Like those are really difficult conversations for me to have. I don't want you to find out that I don't like work that you've produced from the Wednesday column. Like, I don't want that to be how you find out how I feel about your work if I don't like it. And I think part of the reason why I'm comfortable being so clear that that's the reason that I've made the choices that I've made in terms of the thing that I've read about is also kind of going back to scale, not necessarily of the site, but of the team that I work with. Like, if I don't cover a book, there's a really good chance that I'm going to be able to tell one of the other reviewers. I mean, not tell, but like talk to one of the other reviewers and flag it for them and say, hey, somebody came to me, I am not comfortable reviewing this piece, but I think it might be something you've really liked, that you would enjoy, or that you would have a really interesting perspective on. Again, that's what makes it so easy for me to say that. Like, if I have opinions about your book that are good or bad, you are my friend, and I can tell you that. And I also have enough colleagues on the team that I still feel like your work is going to get a fair shake, even if that fair shake is not coming from me.
I kind of forgot. I'll let you go.
I was going to say...
Mey wanted to say something.
Oh.
Well, and I mean, again, honestly, I'm gaining so much respect for all of you right now, because I'm like, I had never heard that used for peg before. Like, I'm just like, I write about my friends, and on like the other rule that I had, so like my two rules, unless like it was like, sometimes I'd write about like if like DC or Marvel like majorly fucked up, you know.
Right.
Or if like someone was like, oh, we have this book coming out this week, would you like to announce it or interview the creator or whatever, I would do that. But like the way I picked the comics that I reviewed was, 1, is it my friend? 2, do I like the comic? And if it was no to both of those, then like I almost definitely wouldn't review it, just because of the complete my column like is not really journalism at all. And I'm a fan, not a critic, I guess is what I would boil it down to.
I think that's kind of cool freedom, having your own column, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's because it's such a different thing than like writing for a site like this, where it's, you know. So yeah, it like I'm just like amazed by all of you being like, dang, you all know your shit.
Building on something Jon Erik was saying a little while ago, this is for like almost no one in the industry our full-time job. And so there's a huge amount of like, I guess you could say it's like editorial selection on the part of the writer as to what you're going to cover. And so, you know, you'll frequently, you know, read, you know, massive stack of comics and then decide from that what you're going to cover. And sometimes that means that, you know, there's stuff from creators that, you know, they might not be your friends, but they might be people you're rooting for. And then you read their comic and you're like, this isn't great. And that goes in the, I'm not going to review this pile. And sometimes, you know, there's something where you read it and you're like, this isn't great, but there's a point I feel needs to be made about this, and so you try to write about it in a way that's not going to like totally kill its sales. And sometimes it's like something that you love, and you're like, I desperately want to write about this, and then your editor's like, what? No.
I think this is kind of an adjacent, but I think, yeah, I'll just go for it.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes. There's a lot of things that the comics journalism side of things of the comics industry really need help with, and I think. That's why I value critique, really honest critique, really fair critique so much, because there are so many overlapping interests. I personally I almost do no editorial work in my writing. My Twitter, it's Twitter. But for that reason, because I don't have the tools to do reviews, and frankly, few people are paid well enough, and critical reviews, especially in this industry, run you, and I think we might get to that later, but run you into you could, upset a creator who has tens or maybe hundreds, I'm not sure what we're dealing with, thousands of followers, and then you're going to be harassed by their fans for the next week, month. There's not really much protection. And so that's why I personally lean away towards doing editorial stuff in general, because if I feel like if something required me to say something really critical about it, and I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that for whatever reason, maybe they're a friend, or maybe they're someone who exists on a marginalized axis and they're already dealing with, systemic problems, I'm not going to feel comfortable spending my time potentially adding to that in a holistic sense. So I do think that's why it's important to support really valuable editorial critique where it's possible, because the way this industry works, it's very hard to find, and it's very dangerous for those who do, speak about that.
So I think that is like a huge limit, and all of us, part of, we want to uplift marginalized voices, but at the same time, it's so hard to write like a negative review of like a marginalized creator's project, even if it sucks. I'm gonna be straight with you, like that's like a real struggle, and eventually, a lot of times it's sort of like, well, I guess we just won't cover it, and it's sort of like, I feel like it does create a really skewed atmosphere for critique. For if I was a marginalized creator, it would probably be like, well, that's maybe I kind of want to know, right? Yeah. And it's hard, I think, especially when a project gets a lot of visibility as like a real vehicle for marginalized voices. It's really hard to be the person to be like, well, I don't think it's actually like doing these things, yeah. Or there are other issues with it that need to be pointed out in the text. But it's like a double-edged sword, because also often marginalized creators are held to a much higher standard than like all the boring shit that like cis straight white dudes are churning out at bigger publishers. So
I literally just wrote earlier this week an article that is a review along those lines, where it's like critical of something by a marginalized creator that I felt like it looked at too narrow an issue and sort of it didn't serve the purpose it meant to. And I don't want to get into it because it's not actually, the piece isn't out yet. It'll be out like later this week or something, but
watch our Twitter mentions.
Yeah. But I literally, like, as I submitted it to our reviews editor, I was like, if you read this and you're like, you think I'm too critical here, and you're like, we shouldn't run this, then that's fine with me. And she was very much like, no, you're very fair here. You made a solid point. So it's going to run at some point.
And likewise, it's especially difficult when you have a piece of media, say by a marginalized creator, that's really great with regards to certain degrees of, marginalized identity, but like offensive on another kind, and you're left with this quandary. Like, you have this responsibility to talk about the way it's impacting you in a certain way, but at the same time, you are aware of that, that systemic pressure that they're feeling. But again, if it's harming another marginalized identity, you have to. But there's a real good chance that, again, that's also going to blow up in a million different ways. Right. And you're just left, there's a bunch of comics where like I feel guilty for not writing about them, I think, in an authentic, I don't write about them, but I want to be able to do that. I want to feel like the industry has the mechanisms to allow for that and protect for that, but unfortunately it doesn't, so you just end up being like, well, I guess I'll just pack this away in my my luggage of anxiety. Right. Luggage of anxiety. Baggage is what I was going for. Anyways.
Luggage of anxiety is terrific, I think.
Yeah. I have a confession to make. I have written maybe no extremely negative reviews ever in my entire career of writing about comics, because I just don't if I read a comic and I don't like it, even if it's something that I've like previously agreed to review, it's very hard for me because I find that stewing on that kind of negativity of something, even if I really legitimately hate it, is like, I see the value in explaining to other people, you know, why I have these strong feelings about it, but I think, and we keep kind of skirting around this issue of like pay and career and stuff, but like I do this in my free time, and at the end of the day, if I don't need negativity from writing like my own reviews, you know, permeating into my life. And I understand why that's not like, you know, an ideal situation for like the state of the industry in general. And I think that people that do take the time to do basically the emotional labor of explaining why a comic was bad or hurtful or made them angry, and I respect that, but I don't feel a responsibility to do that personally, because I don't think that anyone is, I mean, nobody is paying me to do that, and I don't think they're going to, and if they're not going to, then it's my main responsibility is to do what's gonna be best for like me and my health, you know, and I think that that's something that it's really easy to lose sight of, and so I try to think about it very consciously.
Yeah, so pay has come up a lot, so I'm just gonna address the elephant in the room because that's part of writing about comics. It's like a notoriously thorny subject among people who write about comics, or for people who write about comics. It's like nearly impossible for smaller sites to pay their writers, and it's nearly impossible for writers to find like competitively paid gigs writing about comics. So I guess this is like a two-part question. For those of y'all who like run or are editors on websites that depend on unpaid contributors, how do you justify that unpaid work? And for those of you who are writing and especially like have been, how do you think about the work that you're putting in essentially like for free?
Yeah, I mean, like that's the like tragedy of it. Like literally, that's the reason why I had to leave Autostraddle, because I just wasn't making enough money. Like I'm gonna be 32 soon. You know, like I have a ton of bills to pay. I'm trans and depressed and in therapy, and I have epilepsy, so I have a ton of medical bills. And just like Autostraddle was paying me, but because it's an independent site and because advertisers are so reluctant to advertise on queer sites or women's sites, the pay isn't enough for me to maintain all the work I was doing, and like that sucks. And I'm really hoping I can find a new place to write, but again, like I'm just not in a place in my life right now where I can write and not get paid like a living wage, right. And like that's a huge tragedy, you know. Like I hate that.
I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's okay that women write about comics isn't paid, because it's something I've thought about a lot. I have a day job, and I'm almost up to like 4 years now at WAC. So a few years ago I got laid off, and everybody was like, "Oh, so are you gonna be a freelancer now?" And I was like, "Fuck no, I need health insurance." Like, what? Like I can do this because I have a job and health insurance and like other stuff. So that's why I'm able to put in free work for this as an editor and a writer. But I think we create like enough of a community and provide enough resources to our authors that we've seen them. We've had authors go on and start creating their own sustainable freelancing careers, because we offer an editorial structure that I hope is flexible enough for y'all to be able to, like, you're all doing it for free. It's a hobby press. Like, yeah, write about the stuff that you like. That's cool. If you don't want to write negative reviews, like, as long as you're giving us some reviews, like, that's totally fine. And like, we understand that you're doing this because this is something you want to be doing, so we're here to like kind of create, give editorial help that you're not going to find at some other unpaid sites. Like, we have editors, it goes through 2 levels of your editor, and we have copy editors, which is I think a really great bonus. Not a lot of sites, almost no free sites have that. And like we have like a freelancing Slack, so like there's tons of job offers. Like we're trying to help people out who want to get paid to do this stuff. That's not really ever been one of my goals when I started doing this, and I'm really privileged to be able to say that. Like, I'm just, you know, I've got a college degree and I have a decently paying day job in DC, so I can put the time in, and I hope we create a space where other marginalized voices can actually get the experience that they need to move on. And it's not like, we're not selling it as exposure, it's more like, here, you will have a polished portfolio.
I guess the way I feel about this is like a little thorny, but I do feel strongly about this for myself. Like, and I guess I want to preface this by saying, like, I do think that it's important to pay people, and like I know people that are trying to do this for their full-time job, and I see how difficult that is for them, and it really sucks. But for me, like, I don't think I want to get paid to write about comics, and I think it's because of kind of the idea that I've heard people say of like, well, if you find something you love, make sure you don't do it for your job, or you'll never love it again. And that's kind of how I feel about writing about comics. I do some freelance writing otherwise, and I've had some good experiences with it, but I find it very anxiety-inducing, and I've been in a bunch of situations with editors for non-comics related freelance where I'm like, why am I doing this? I'm like, why did I agree to do this? I'm not getting paid enough to do this. And they have all these expectations on me and deadlines and editing, and they're not thinking about the rest of my schedule and the rest of my life and my day job, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I get myself into these like very anxious states, and then I burn out quickly. I do like a couple freelance things, and then I'm like, I'm not doing this anymore, and then I do, but it's a different story. But like the idea of like kind of, for me, keeping comics as like this slightly separate thing from that has been really helpful, and it's empowered me to be like, well, I don't feel up to doing this, and therefore I'm not going to do it. I don't want to write negative reviews about this, so I'm not going to do it. I have these deadlines that I'm feeling stressed out about, so I'm going to express, like, I don't think I can make these deadlines, and not feel guilty about telling people that, like, I'm sorry, but I have to take care of myself. And I think that, like, carving out this space, for me, it's made it very accessible to do kind of the amount I want and not more. And I fell into comics, writing about comics, completely accidentally. Like, someone I knew was like, oh, this new comic came out that you seem like you like. Do you want to review it? And I was like, what? They have to review it? And like, if I was trying this idea of like having to pitch myself and sell myself, like, that's not how it started for me. I fell into this thing, and now I do it, and now, you know, I feel like I have this voice in the community, which is like kind of a cool feeling, and it happened all by accident, and that's because of sites like Rogues Portal was actually the first place that I wrote for, and they also have an editorial staff that like helped me out with stuff while I was first doing this, and like set up interviews for me and helped me out with all these things. And like I felt like, wow, now this is like a whole hobby that I didn't even like know existed, that now I can do, and I can it can be rewarding for me.
I think there's a big difference between sites where no one is paid and it's a labor of love for everyone, and it's like people just trying to, you know, have their collective voice heard, and sites where there's a few people who get paid and then a lot of unpaid contributors, and those feel very predatory. And so I think it's very important to distinguish things like Rogues Portal and Women Write About Comics from some other sites, which I'm not going to name, but you know, yeah. And then also, you know, there's, once you get to the level of like the big name sites, there's a huge difference between what the staff editors and writers are paid and what the freelancers are paid. So, you know, I'll actually tell you some numbers. So like writing like freelance comics articles, the most I've ever been paid was just over $150 for an article that was mentioned on air on the BBC. That got me like name dropped in Teen Vogue. Yeah, I know, that was like, I was like, I was named in Teen Vogue. And like, it was just like, I had more hits than like Batman had sales that month. And so, and like, I got $150 for it. And most of my writing, you know, like 1,000-word pieces, you know, whatever, I'd get like $25 to $35. Not great pay, but it's like, if I had something that I really wanted to say and like share and like get out there, then I would, you know, say, yeah, this is, you know, worth $35 for me or whatever, but the pay is not good.
I was gonna add, like our authors that have really moved on, like Clara, to really start a freelance career are not really getting that freelance money from comics writing.
Yeah.
Like, if you're moving into a review editorial space like movies, television, that stuff, that still is paying, like, it's paying more than comics at least. So, yeah, that's...
Yeah.
that's
I get paid much more to write about gender than I do about comics, and then I get paid much more to write about the law than I do about gender.
So I guess on that note, we're running out of time, but I wanted to open it up to the floor if y'all have any questions. I'll go with you. And then...
sorry, I wrote it down so I didn't forget it. Just kind of for those of you who review or critique both like big books and indie books, how do you find yourself in your commentary compensating for the fact that, say, for example, a lot of that indie stuff may not have the editorial support before it gets to you? Mm-hmm. You know, like, do you end up grading on a curve, or do you just end up being, you know, straight up, this is what it is, but, you know, like, so kind of like, how do you navigate that in your own work?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, like, the comics from the big two are honestly not as good as most indie comics. They're so like trapped in this narrow view of what superhero art is and superhero stories are, or even like other larger publishers, they have, again, narrow ideas of what the art and stories should be. And so from indie books, you get these amazing things that I think, in my opinion, are much more fun to read and much more interesting, much more challenging. And so, I mean, I kind of grade on the opposite curve, where indie books like are better than big books to me.
Sorry.
I don't think I've run into any editorial problems that bad that it was like, I gotta like F this book because it's given enough. I would definitely mention it, but I've definitely seen things in reviews I've edited that are like, hey, you know, there's some issues with this and this, but it doesn't, overall it's a great reading experience, so the story is worth moving past it. So I do think though, because I've definitely read big two books that have bad, shoddy editorializing, and I've never had to be like, oh, but you can still enjoy this Batman story even though the dialogue is stilted or whatever.
So I guess we're getting kicked out of the room.
We can like make final statements if y'all want to.
Okay. Pronouns. So I'm she, her, they, them.
Should we say where you can find us?
Oh, and you can find me at Mallory_Yu on Twitter, or on the NPR website.
Cat Overland, she, her, and you can find me at Dog Underwater on Twitter, all one word, it's the opposite of my name.
Jon Erik, you can find me on Twitter as well at honestlyjon, John spelled Jon. Oh, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
CP Hoffman, they, them, and you can find me at cphwriter on twitter.com.
Jameson Hampton, they, them, and you can find me at Jamie Bash on Twitter. That's Jamie spelled Jamey. And also, I didn't get Dog Underwater until right now, and I'm like, my mind is blown.
Wait, I don't get it.
Her name is Cat Overland.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
That was me 6 months ago.
That was me a year ago.
Yeah, thank you, Stewart. Thank you for asking he, him pronouns. You can find me at CKFabe, CKAYFABE on Twitter. If you're a wrestling fan, yes, that is the joke. So yeah, thank you.
All right.
And I'll finish up with the weird spellings of names. Mey Rude on everything. MEYRUDE. I use she, her pronouns.
Great. And we'll be kind of hanging out outside, or you can find us on the show floor. When we're done, thanks for coming, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for going downstairs and back up.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I feel closer to you all now.
yeah. We've shared an escalator.
Twice.
Overland, dog underwater.